Hi everyone, welcome to Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2024. This webinar is part of Law Awareness Weeks CDC 2024. It is a collaboration between Bono SG, the 5 community development councils, National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, Singapore University of Social Sciences School of Law, Singapore Management University School of Law, the Singapore Corporate Counsel Association Pro Bono Chapter, and the Singapore Association of Social Workers, and it's supported by the People's Association. My name is Sadhana, and I'm happy to be your host for this session. Singapore is well known for being a green city. Every corner you turn, there's a tree, there's a plant, there are animals, there are birds, and it seems like we're a sanctuary. But how green are we really? What are the laws that protect our greenery? And what can you do to ensure that our plants and our natural environment is protected? Today's webinar is about the legal protection for Singapore's biodiversity, your backyard sanctuary. Some housekeeping matters first. Today we'll be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A. You can submit your questions at any point during the webinar and also upvote any of the questions that may interest you. If you have a smartphone or a tablet, just launch your internet browser and enter www.pigeonhole.at into the address bar, and you can key in the event passcode that you see on your screens, LAWCDC 2401. Alternatively, you can click the link that's shared in the chat function to launch Pigeonhole on your devices. If you're viewing this webinar on your desktop or laptop, you should receive an invitation already to launch Pigeonhole. And we invite your questions and hope that you will be interactive with both our speakers, who I will now go on to introduce. But before I do that, as a lawyer myself, I have some qualifications. Please note that today's discussion is not intended to substitute any form of professional legal advice. If you require specific legal advice, please consult a lawyer. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar, Dr. Joseph Chun and Mr. Ganesh Kumar. Joseph is an environmental lawyer at Lin Bok LLP and leads the firm's environmental, social, and governance practice. He is concurrently an adjunct associate professor and a member of the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law at the Faculty of Law at NUS, where he also teaches environmental law. He has written widely on environmental law and ESG and is the lead author of Singapore's only environmental law textbook. Joseph volunteers as a member of the Singapore Venture Capital and Private Equity Association's ESG Committee, the Asia Pacific Regional Board of the Global Alliance of Impact Lawyers, the International Union for Conservation of Nature's World Commission on Environmental Law, and the Mandai Wildlife Group's Animal Welfare and Ethics Committee. He also regularly works with local green civil society groups on advocacy projects and reports. A very warm welcome, Joseph. The next person that it is my pleasure to introduce is Ganesh. Ganesh is the chairman of Woodlands Botanical Garden, Singapore's largest community garden spanning 4,000 square meters in size and 9 stories in height. It is the only community garden dedicated to biodiversity and mental wellness. With no consumption of materials from the garden, any flowers, leaves, and edibles are purely planted for nature and her creatures. And the subconscious engagement of the 5 senses have helped officially establish WBG, Woodlands Botanical Gardens, as the therapeutic node of the North. The garden aims to be as inclusive as she possibly can, providing tours and activities for all demographics and ensuring that all programs do not carry any cost and are freely accessible. This creates a sense of kampong spirit that serves as an inspiration for other communities as well. WBG has several rare and vulnerable species, and I won't spoil it for the audience. I'm sure you'll go into what these species are, but they include a number of butterflies and also many other species that are attempted to be protected under the area of WBG, especially the butterfly that I shall not name now, which is an internationally protected species. And the conservation program for this specific butterfly is being spearheaded and run solely by WBG. Very warm welcome, Ganesh. All right, let's jump straight into it. We've spent some time on introductions. Actually, I did want to talk about the WBG because it's the first thing that really piqued my interest. Maybe let's talk about that. Could you tell us a little bit more? What is the Woodlands Botanical Gardens?
So the Woodlands Botanical Garden actually started out of COVID. It was a time we couldn't go to work. I couldn't go to school, Yeah, so it was born during that period in July 2020. And we were quite an unorthodox garden because we started with a community first and then we became a community garden. Yeah, so that's one thing special about the garden. And another thing is that we have about 2,000 community gardens in Singapore, and almost all of them, or rather all of them, focus on edibles. And I wanted to do something different. I always thought we aren't looking after nature enough, Yeah, so that's when I started to develop a biodiversity garden instead. And I think with that, we piqued the interest of many people out there who were interested in butterflies, in birds, in bees. Yeah, so it's a very unique garden, very different type of garden. And
we have some pictures on slide 9 and 10. So I'm going to get that to be flashed up as you speak.
Okay. Yeah, so I think if you can see the slides, there's a before and after photo, I think. There are a couple of slides on that. Yeah, so you can see what used to be just a grassy hill patch, right? It's now a thriving ecosystem. Yeah, it was not easy to do this because, okay, at the time of the photos, the grass was cut, but actually it was a lalang patch. So for us Singaporeans, we know lalang is so difficult to remove, So it's a lot of painstaking work, but you can see what has evolved from that. Yeah. So we have a lot more life at this garden now, a lot of birds, bees. As Sadhana mentioned, we have rare species as well, which I'll touch on a bit more later. Yeah. So do come down to visit us, given a chance.
My favorite story, Ganesh, that I've heard from you is how you choose what plants to plant. And a lot of it is not because us as human beings want to see that plant or think that it's beautiful, but it really is how, if you plant a certain plant in a particular location, the birds may start feeding on the caterpillars, and so you need to be very intelligent in the way you plant it to encourage flora and fauna. That story really stuck with me.
Thanks. Yeah, so we do a lot of observation in the garden. Textbooks tell you one thing, but nothing like sitting down and just observing what nature wants, and what is happening with nature. Yeah, and how biodiversity works, especially starting with an empty patch like that, we needed to make sure that we knew what we were doing. Going in. So we started, of course, we had lessons to learn along the way, but nature is the best teacher, right? Yeah. So like what you mentioned, we identified what plants should not be next to other plants so that the biodiversity can thrive. Yeah. So these are the lessons that we learned along the way, and we hope to also teach to other gardens as well.
As biodiversity thrives, it also needs to be protected. And that's where I would like to say lawyers come in. Joseph, could you share with us what are the existing local and international laws that serve to protect biodiversity?
Right. So there's the Convention on Biological Diversity that focuses on conservation of biodiversity as well as the sustainable use of the elements of biodiversity. And then there is CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, mouthful. And that focuses on the international trade of endangered species of plants and animals. Locally, the two legislation would be the Parks and Trees Act that focuses on protection of habitats, particularly nature reserves and public parks. And then you have the Wildlife Act, which focuses on wildlife species.
Can you tell us, I know that the Parks and Trees Act and the Wildlife Act actually set out certain activities that are prohibited, right? Could you share with us what are some of the activities that are prohibited? Like, if I see a very nice smelling flower, can I pluck it? Can I put it in my hair? What can we do in the parks?
Okay, so I draw a distinction between prohibited activities and restricted activities. Restricted activities are those for which you require permission from the Commissioner of Parks and Trees. Then the prohibited activities are those which you cannot do and you cannot get permission to do those things. So in a nature reserve or public park, certain things you can do with permission, and there are things like cutting trees or maybe collecting eggs. All that you can do with permission. However, there are certain things you cannot do in a nature reserve, such as doing anything which you know will injure an animal or kill it, or doing something which you know will damage the tree or plant in a park. Those things you cannot get permission to do because they are prohibited.
What about, I've seen this quite a number of times. You see little terrapins and turtles in wildlife, basically, or rather what you think is wildlife, but it may have been released because they were previously pets. Is it legal for people to do that?
So you cannot release wildlife into the nature reserve. Well, I think that's you cannot release them into the nature reserve. There are other areas where you can bring them into, but if they escape, then can't be helped. But then you cannot deliberately release them either under the Wildlife Act.
I suppose there are sanctuaries where you can bring your animals to if you cannot continue to care for them. And we will go into that a little bit more on Wednesday, when we have another chat about our furry animals. It's another webinar that's also hosted by the Law Awareness Weeks at CDC. So please catch that and sign up for it if you haven't already. I'd like to go on to Ganesh, actually, because all these laws that we've just talked about under the Wildlife Act, for example, and the Natures and Trees Act, I think you were referring to. Parks and Trees, my apologies. How do these laws apply to you in a practical manner when you are developing your garden?
Okay, so I think that a lot of people don't understand that we are not allowed to remove stuff from our parks, our public parks and all this. So sometimes what happens is at our garden, some of them do pluck flowers. That is I think it's a pretty obvious no actually. But one thing that people might not be aware is that we can't pick up dead flowers as well. Anything that falls there also is part of the park. Yeah. And we do try to tell people and try to make them understand that that is still part of the ecosystem, you see. Yeah. So, we don't actually need it, right? And even flowers, let's say the most common one, the blue pea, butterfly pea flowers, right? You know that, yes, there are some slight health benefits to this, but at the end of the day, we can buy a lot more supplements and other natural products off the shelf, right? But these flowers play a big part in biodiversity as well, right? Because they attract bees. Bees and blues and purples are big favorites for bees. So I always tell them leave it for the bees lah. Yeah. So leave the flowers there. Whatever falls also, it still goes back into the ecosystem. It's compost. Yeah. It's mulch. Yeah. So it's still very useful to the ecosystem. Much more useful to nature than to us. Yeah. So this is one thing that we try to educate people on. And then of course, insects, right? Because a lot of times, most of the people catching these insects, either they know a lot or they don't know enough. So they know a lot of people, they try to go for the prized possessions, right? Like especially our endangered species. Yeah, like the common birdwing, the common rose. These are two of the hot butterflies in the garden that people tend to go for. So they take these butterflies home and even their caterpillars. The thing is, if you don't have their host plant, which they need to feed on, you won't be able to look after them. So you're actually being detrimental to nature instead, Yeah. So you should know better, actually, having this information. And for those who don't know, sometimes you catch them and they are really rare, right? So you catch them, all the more you don't know how to look after them, right? So that is the biggest harm you're creating to nature. And, it's not the same as seeing a butterfly flying in the open. It's not the same as keeping it in a tank, right? Yeah. So in a tank, it's not beautiful to me. Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting perspective, because we talk about Singapore having backyard sanctuaries and how when you're walking, there are just these flowers like the blue pea flower I think you were talking about. There's so many of it growing along my estate. And as I'm walking along the pavement, I'm always thinking, why can't I just take one? It'll make for a very good, there's this blue pea nasi lemak that you can cook, it's very delicious and it's so interesting. And I keep thinking, I mean, I'm no culinary genius. I think I can cook it, but I know I can't. But why not? Why not just take a little bit and go home? What's the deal with that, right? And I'm seeing a different perspective that actually there is a natural cycle, right? And it's about allowing, even if the plant has fallen to the ground, allowing it to give back to earth and for it to replenish the earth, as opposed to simply thinking it's trash, because there is a purpose for it. And I think that perspective is so important. I want to go back to Joseph now and talk about endangered species, because we have I suppose the wildlife trade is a flourishing one. My understanding is that it is very rich illegal trade, and it does fund other vices as well. So I'm quite curious to know, especially in light of recent pronouncements as well, as to what illegal wildlife trafficking is, how it's being treated in Singapore. What are the laws that protect endangered species? And in Singapore especially, what's being done to protect endangered species?
Okay, so maybe before I answer that question, I wanted to add to Ganesh's answer to clarify that the Woodlands Botanical Gardens is actually a public park under the definition of the Parks and Trees Act. So it comes with all the protection that you get for the public parks. So back to your question about endangered species. So our Wildlife Act actually doesn't only protect wildlife, doesn't only protect endangered species, it protects all wildlife from intentional killing, taking, trapping, keeping. However, for certain species that are prescribed, considered, well, more endangered, they carry enhanced punishment. If you do a number of offenses under the Wildlife Act, then the punishment is enhanced. Separately, there is prohibition. Okay, I should say there is a requirement for approval if you are trying to sell wildlife in Singapore. And then in addition, under CITES, which Singapore is a party to, Singapore has the Endangered Species Import and Export Act. That one regulates the import and export of wildlife that is internationally considered endangered, and you will need permits from NParks or from the country of export if you are importing them from overseas.
What are some of the endangered species that we often see in Singapore, but we don't realize are endangered?
Well, okay, the one that comes to my mind is the pangolin. I don't think it's something we often see.
Yes.
Although I think I haven't seen one myself, but I think people do come across it in nature reserves, and we also read about people catching it illegally, of course. And of course, you also read about people illegally smuggling pangolin scales. Okay, so those are punishable offenses.
Yeah, I recall the recent case of a man who had kidnapped a pregnant pangolin, and tried to sell it online, right? And I think there are so many of those types of cases. People don't realize that it's actually a fairly serious offense, because pangolins are endangered species as well. Another type of animal that I've heard of are the Indian star tortoises, which people don't quite, I mean, they think it's just a regular, tortoise, but it's actually an endangered species as well. And I think being mindful and aware of the endangered status of these animals would really help. But I think, Ganesh, you do have some endangered species in the Woodlands Botanical Gardens as well. You want to share about that?
Yeah, so just one comment on what Joseph said. I have seen a pangolin in real life, at when I was at NTU.
Do you buy
And-
40?
I was thinking, what is this coming out of the drain? It's a gorgeous creature. Yeah, we should never hurt it. Yeah, so just to share for our side, we have this butterfly called the common birdwing.
Yes.
So I think there'll be a picture. Yeah. So you look at the image of this butterfly, it's a gorgeous butterfly. Like it's one of those butterflies that you see and you just stop in your tracks. Yeah. And what's important, what is special about this butterfly is also Singapore's largest butterfly. Its wingspan can be 15 to 20 cm big. That is how it got its name of birdwing. Yeah. So this is the only butterfly actually under the CITES that Joseph mentioned. that is internationally protected in Singapore. Yeah, and it's actually listed as vulnerable in our Red Book. So it's a very crucial butterfly. Because why? It's a forest butterfly, so it thrives on plants in the forest. And so what we did to try to help this butterfly earlier this year in March was we actually launched a campaign, sort of campaign for this butterfly, where we have given out the seeds for this plant, the Dutchman's pipe. Citizens, we try to involve citizens as much as possible in our projects, and where they bring home the seeds and they grow them. And one thing that they have realized is it's not so easy to grow this plant, right? Because they are forest plants. They need a specific condition, type of atmosphere to grow. Yeah. So that was also my way of teaching people that, it's not so easy, right? Yeah. So and the plants take very long to grow. Yeah. So this is what we are trying to actually help this butterfly come out of its vulnerable status in Singapore. And hopefully it will be no more an endangered species on the world list as well.
It's a very strange name for an endangered species to call it a common birdwing when it's not so common and endangered.
Yeah, true. I've asked this question to many butterfly people. No answer so far, nothing on the internet. But I think that there are a few birdwings, and then this is the most common, I guess. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone there. Yeah.
There is a question that's just come in from a member of our audience. I remember that Hort Park used to give out plant trimmings once a month when their contractors carried out their regular maintenance. However, under the Parks and Trees Act, this practice is not encouraged. Is it allowed? Is it not allowed? Any one of you can take this question?
Okay, by right, as far as I know, contractors are not allowed to give anything from the parks, because why? It will create problem, tension, like how come this person can get, I can't get. So I do understand why the rules are such, and by right, contractors are not allowed to deal with the public on these matters. Yeah, you can approach the NParks officers themselves if you need something. That is up to their discretion. They have the authority to decide. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the acts that require approval. So it depends on whether the Commissioner for Parks and Trees has given his approval. So we wouldn't know that.
Actually, this segues very nicely into the next question that I had for you, Joseph. If I get some trimmings, or if I get some, trimmings from Ganesh, from your personal garden, of course, or if I get some seeds that someone has given me, can I just plant it in an empty patch that's near my house? Can I just start a garden of my own? Or do I need some special permission?
So in Singapore, there isn't an empty patch of land that doesn't belong to anyone. So I think probably the empty patch would belong to the state, and it would be state land. So you will need permission from the owner, i.e. the state, if you wanted to plant anything on it.
Can you tell us about the Planning Act of 1998 and how that features in the legislation?
So the Planning Act does two things. It regulates, it kind of zones Singapore into various kind of land users to make sure that the land users that are close to each other are compatible. So you wouldn't have the heavy industrial activities next to residential areas or next to areas that are rich in biodiversity. The second thing that the Planning Act does is that it also regulates development. So any person who wants to do any development work on any piece of land, whether private as well as public, will actually have to get approval from the URA under the Planning Act. And one of the things, if they, as a matter of policy, not as a matter of legislation, if they think that or if they find that the proposed development work is near a nature area or nature reserve, or near the coast or the coastal development, or if it's something that has transboundary environmental impact, then they will typically require as a condition before giving permission that environmental impact assessment has to be done. And so that's EIA, an environmental impact assessment. So that kind of protects the environment, yeah.
I wanted to talk to Ganesh about this as well, because when you started your garden, it was rather unconventional.
Yep.
And you eventually did seek approval. Could you tell us about that process?
Okay, so I think it's a very commonly asked question at our garden, especially by people who want to start a new garden. Yeah. So my first question is, or rather my first comment will be, do you know who owns that land? So like what Joseph said, it's all government land, right? So find out who owns the land. For example, for us, our garden is a little bigger than most gardens, right? So we actually had to ask permission from both NParks and Town Council because we overlap onto both lands. Yeah, so if ever anyone wants to set up a garden and wants to deal with either agency, you can come and find me. Yeah, since we have dealt with both. Yeah, so find out who is the landowner because eventually, the truth is they are your boss later on. You have to answer to them for anything, right? Yeah, and secondly, and more importantly, right, I think the big question is, who are you planting for? If you want to plant for yourself, then don't put our authorities in the spot lah. That's what I would say. Yeah, because you want to plant chili just because you want to cook at home, right? Then that's not fair. But if you think that you can have a greater purpose, you can do something for the community, for the masses, then write in properly. Write in properly, explain to them what it's for. And yeah, that is how we also went through our process. I was asked a lot of questions on biodiversity, on choice of plants, my plant palette, my experience. Yeah, so it was a big old trivia before they approved it. So these are the two things you have to take note: who owns the land, and who are you planting for? Yeah.
In any event, we now have quite a number of community gardens in which you can plant things like, chili and the small cucumbers, So I think there are options. If you are interested in trying to start your own garden, you can contribute to an already existing garden. There are some questions coming in on whether you need approval to trim trees that are growing within your own garden. So for example, if I have my own garden and I'm growing, for example, a mango tree, or one of those trees that tend to need trimming, is it something that you need approval for? I think Joseph, you can address this.
So the regulation of cutting of trees comes under the Parks and Trees Act. And it says that if your tree, if any tree is on vacant or green land, as in green birch kind of land, and it's got at least 1 meter diameter, measured 1 meter from the ground, then you need to get permission before you can cut it. For other trees, if it's on your own land, there's nothing to stop you from cutting that tree. So yeah, only the big trees that are 1 meter in diameter or more, you need to get permission from the NParks.
Again,
could I just add on to that one?
Of course.
Yeah, because I think maybe some of them are asking about living in a landed house, and maybe if your tree encroaches into the neighbor's house. So anything that's beyond your boundary by right, the neighbor has the right to cut it off. Yeah, I'm sharing from personal experiences when I lived in a landed house. Yeah, so I've come across this situation many times with my neighbors, Yeah, so you have to understand that their space is their space, your space is your space. So even if yeah, like what Joseph mentioned also, if it's going onto government side, then they have the right to trim off whatever goes onto their side as well. Yeah.
I think that's the challenge of staying in such a land scarce country like Singapore, and I don't think nature draws a distinction between property on the grounds of where the postal code is or what the address is. It just grows, right? And I guess it's about also cooperating. Maybe you can share the fruit with your neighbor so that the tree kind of can thrive.
Make everyone happy.
Yeah, to make everyone happy, to cooperate. I wanted to move into the next segment, which is interaction with humans and some of the key challenges that we face with the environment. I think, like I mentioned, I think with Singapore being such a dense country, there is a lot of interaction with human beings, especially when it comes to wildlife, and I would say with plants even, right? I've often seen certain landscapes get redefined, especially in the interests of development, as new ECs are being built, trees are disappearing or being replanted. So I think the questions that then arises would be, what are our responsibilities as co-occupants? And I view it as we are occupying nature, and not nature is taking up space in our environment, right? We have to survive in the context of, whatever's existing in our environment. So maybe we can start with Joseph. Can you please share with us, what do you think are some of our responsibilities as co-occupants of the environment?
So maybe I'll just focus on the legal responsibilities. Under the first of all, if it's in a nature reserve or public park, then you absolutely have to leave the animal alone, because you can't even try and harass it, for example, or disturb its nest. Under the Wildlife Act, which applies to wildlife wherever it is, inside or outside the park and so on, you cannot intentionally kill or take or trap or keep the animal. You cannot intentionally feed it. You also cannot, what else can you not do? You can't sell it, for example. So there are a whole host of things that you cannot do unless you get the permission from NParks.
I think I've also, on many occasions, I mean, in my area, there is a family of otters, and they tend to be very cute, but they've also invaded some of our homes. They've eaten the koi fish, some very expensive dinners that they've had. Can you do anything to protect yourself against, the murderous otters?
So there are exceptions to what I just said earlier, and one of the exceptions which I'm not very satisfied with is that there's a very old provision in the Wildlife Act that says that you are allowed to kill or to trap animals, but you cannot keep them. You can kill or trap them if they are found damaging your property, or if you are the occupier and they are found damaging property that you are managing. So that is an exception.
Well, so to me, that's the tension, that I cannot keep a friendly otter who would make for a very good furry companion, but I'm allowed to kill it or trap it, right? And I think that possibly, not that I want to keep an otter, but I think that possibly could be relooked, and also perhaps people could be encouraged to call in acres or call in NParks to assist with the humane removal of a wildlife that may have found its way to your house. Ganesh, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? Like, what if you find yourself, especially in your garden, I'm sure you attract quite a fair bit of wildlife as well. Have you come across any species where you've thought, this probably needs to be removed, and how do I do that?
Okay, so for us, I would say that fortunately we haven't had that scenario. Yeah, so we have not had anything that we needed to remove, because for our park we are pretty lucky. Although we are backed by a secondary forest, we don't have big mammals there. So no monkeys, no boars, Yeah, so we don't really face this issue over there lah. But just to add on something about protecting this wildlife, right? Yeah, I think that one thing that we faced a lot was rather how do we make sure that people don't come and remove that wildlife, right? So one thing that I learned was the power of social media to do both good and bad, right? Yeah, so like if you see in August, we had this article that came out about this Asian soft-shell turtle that was found in Jurong, right? And yeah, within just a short while of it being posted on social media, it was basically turtle napped.
Oh
Right?
dear.
Yeah, someone removed it, and actually it's a species that's protected under the Wildlife Act, 1965. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that, like in our garden, one sad problem that we have is I used to post a lot more on the different type of flowers and wildlife that we used to have. But if you see our social media now, I cut down a lot on that, because why? Once I post them, people come to take them, Yeah, so I think that's a bit sad. So I do hope that people can also post more responsibly on social media. Yeah, like for example, if you find something endangered and it's very close within human reach, right? Don't post the location. I think that's very important.
About this flower that was found and then it was subsequently removed. I think it's on the next slide. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I just shared on the tortoise, the turtle, but there was, I think in 2021, there was an article, a number of articles that came out on the elephant foot yam or corpse flower. So it was creating quite a stir because, yeah, I mean, as per its name, it smells like a rotting corpse, right? So it was very intriguing because the flower is huge. But within few days of it being posted, even by its own Sembawang's own MP and all this, someone came and viciously removed that plant. Yeah, it's such a pity because it was such an intriguing plant, and I think we always just, for us in the nature field, right? We're always trying to find ways to get people interested in nature, right? Getting the avenue into nature. Yeah, so this was one easy way because it was in a convenient location. People had access to it, and we could all have just been fascinated with this wonderful flower because we're all used to sweet smelling flowers, and suddenly this one pops up, right? But it was so sad that, because now people were aware of it, it was removed. Yeah. So that is what I mean by responsibly posting, But sometimes it's very difficult, right? You don't know where, yeah, it's a very gray area. Yeah.
There are penalties for removing the flower, right? I think Joseph talked about it earlier. Do you think the solution would be to have more cameras and CCTVs around to capture this? Or do you think the solution is education, to educate people about why removing the flower is more detrimental?
Okay,
to
I
the
mean, great
environment?
question, because this question has also passed through our garden many times, and the truth is, I think I mentioned earlier on also, many people know what they shouldn't do, yeah, but yet they go ahead and do it. So education, I feel, is important, but sadly, I think the cameras would play a bigger part. Like you see our MRT stations and all, there are like 50, 60 cameras at each exit, right? It's yeah, pretty interesting. Yeah, if you could just have 2 or 3 of that for the garden, I think it would help. But at the same time, I was just talking to some of my visitors today. I think people who want to steal, they'll find a way lah.
Yes.
Yeah, like we have 2 cameras in the garden, but somehow they are never caught. Yeah, so more cameras would be better, I feel. Yeah, it would still help. It would still help. Yeah.
So I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, what we want to see more of and how we think we can improve the status of the laws in Singapore. But I just wanted to go back to Joseph and really talk about what are some of the options we have if we are somewhat threatened by the environment, right? So for example, again, otters, because they have a terrible reputation. They are an invasive species. They are invading my garden. Do I call pest control? And you said that we actually, legally you are allowed to kill them, but what are some of the other available options apart from resorting to otter murder?
So the exception to intentionally killing, trapping, etc., is that they are at that point in time damaging your property. But if they have already eaten your fish, you cannot, having found them, in the garden, but they are no longer eating the fish, you cannot kill them because
Yes.
they are not at that point of time damaging your property. They have already damaged it.
Yes.
Of course, if they're not even doing anything, it's just being there, then the exception doesn't even apply in the first place. So if you feel threatened, for example, if you see a python in your garden, then what you can do is call NParks or call ACRES. ACRES is a NGO, and they have a hotline on their website. So they're trained to remove the animal and put it to a safe place without hurting or harming the animals. Pest control companies, I think the level of capability will vary. Some are trained to handle wildlife and others are not. So the risk is that the pest control company whose staff or workers are not trained to handle wildlife may come and in the course of removing the wildlife end up injuring it or worse, causing its death. So I think call for trained personnel would be a better option.
Thank you for that. I received a comment and I think it's very important to highlight. It's not a question. Thank you for organizing this informative session. Thank you very much. There are plenty of tips to prevent otters from eating pet fish or civets entering attics at this website, www.ourwildneighbours.sg. I think we will check out the website first before we share it in the comments, but I think it's a very important comment. I think, we share the same space. It is inevitable that there will be some overlap and encroachment, and I think it's about being humane in our approach and recognizing that as animals, this is their nature. And we have, our human nature as well is also about being compassionate. It's also about understanding how to deal with these types of issues in a very humane way as well. I like what Joseph said. I think if they're not actively at that point in time causing damage, reacting in anger, reacting, because you think it's your right to react that way, may not be ideal. Or actually, more importantly, I was about to add, it's not legal. And so it would be best to call for help. I think NParks, like what you said, or ACRES would be a good first port of call. What if it's an injured animal? And I think, I'm like an angel of mercy and I'm coming in and I'm putting it out of its misery. Is that legal?
As in putting it out of misery, because that would still be intentionally killing the animal.
Yes.
Same advice, I think, is to call NParks or ACRES. But I also wanted to comment about the advice from the viewer to say that yes, there is this group called Auto Watch or something, and to get the with NParks to actually work with the landowners to help otter-proof their properties, especially in areas or places where otters have been sighted. How do you prevent otters entering your premises in the first place, especially if you have a koi garden, right? So they teach people how to erect their fences properly, because I think apparently the otters can burrow underneath the fences and so on. So all this they are doing their part. So there are ways to minimize or even eliminate the risk of otters entering your premises.
I think they are utterly deplorable when they do such things, That was my one joke for today. Okay, I wanted to move on to another question. Hypothetically, if a plant hinders your safety, would it be okay to pluck it out? I don't know what kind of plant, maybe a Venus flytrap or something like that. If there's a plant that hinders your safety, would it be okay for a person to remove it?
Okay, I think that question, are you asking in our garden or generally?
I suppose in a public park.
Okay. I think it boils down again to what Joseph said. The fact of the matter is still, it's not your property. So inform the relevant authorities. I think nowadays it's very convenient, with the One Service app and all, and they are very responsive. So try not to take matters into your own hands unless it's affecting you so greatly at that point of time. Yeah. If you can wait just a little while, just inform the authorities, and then you don't get into trouble as well, and everything is done safely. Because if the plant could hurt you, then all the more you shouldn't be touching it, Yeah.
Go ahead. So I can't think of a situation where a plant is threatening you to the point where you have no time, NParks, whatever. I mean, I would think at the very least you can run away from the plant. I mean, what situation would there be where there's really no time to do anything except, destroy the plant?
Yeah.
I suppose, one situation would be where you've informed the authorities, or for example, if a neighbor's tree or a plant is growing in a manner that's unsafe, right? Whether it appears as though, a heavy branch may fall, may hurt someone. There may be questions about whether I can remove it. But I think both of you answered the question earlier that if it is encroaching upon your property, you can. And I also think it's always important to reach out to the authorities first before, doing something on your own. I wanted to talk about threats, right? And I'll start with Joseph first. What are some of the threats to biodiversity which you have observed?
Okay, so apart from the human-wildlife conflict, meaning to say where wildlife enters sort of urban centers and then people take matters into their own hands. So that's one. The other, I think the biggest threat to biodiversity is the threat of developments to the habitats of this wildlife. The areas where this wildlife can live and thrive is shrinking. And not only is it shrinking, it's also becoming fragmented. And that makes it also very hard for the wildlife to move from one place to another. So yeah, I would say the biggest threat is actually the kind of never-ending development and clearing and fragmenting of the nature areas for this wildlife.
Ganesh?
Okay, I agree with Joseph. I think recently we all know about the case of Turf City, I think, where they said they're keeping 2 forest patches, they're retaining 2 forest patches, but sometimes we have to think whether would it be better to have 1 forest patch the size of the 2 patches joined together. Because animals, especially bigger animals, they need their space. And that's the reason we are having more human wildlife conflicts, right? Because they are fighting between their own territories, and then they come out because they're chased out or they don't have space. Yeah, that is the reason why it's increasing so much, right? These conflicts. Yeah, so sometimes I think that, like what Joseph mentioned, if we have to develop, but at least we have to take into consideration of keeping bigger areas for this biodiversity. Yeah.
I think we can actually see some of this conflict manifesting as very real interactions, right? So for example, there are a lot of these videos of monkeys scaling HDB flats, trying to get in, trying to get at the food that's in there. And I think the perennial question is, how do we draw a balance between growth and development through the form of the development of landscape into something that's a little bit more urban versus maintaining our garden spaces, maintaining our forests. Perhaps it would be interesting to hear from both of you. What are some of the benefits of maintaining a forest or maintaining a garden such that it can also contribute to urban development? So things like, mental health, for example, or having more greenery adds a certain value to society. Maybe we can start with Ganesh first, and then I'll move on to Joseph.
Okay, I think there's a very good example a few years back. I think most people would remember our Cross Island line, right? If you recall, there was a long debate on whether it should pass under McRitchie Reservoir or not, our central catchment area, right? And eventually in 2019, they decided to pass under the reservoir, under the catchment area. Although a lot of nature people were against it. And in my personal opinion, the main reason given was it would save 6 minutes. 6 minutes to protect our nature reserve, I think no one is going to think twice, no logical person would think twice. And I think, to me, in my personal opinion, I feel we could have done that 6 minutes. Because technically speaking, if you want to go from A to B that took you 1 hour, your Cross Island line is going to make it 30 minutes. What about just 36 minutes? You're still saving 24 minutes, right? So that was my thought process at that time, right? But for these 6 minutes, you could lose something that you could never get back again. Yeah, so I think these are very important considerations, and definitely if a proper poll was done, I can stand by my Singaporean, friends, all my people here, and we would have definitely opted for the 6 minute detour. Yeah. So they may say that they dug deeper and all this to mitigate the issues that could have come, but the fact of the matter is still you're touching the reservoir. I mean the reserve, right? Yeah. So that was a bit of an unhappy moment for me, but that's where there was a choice in that development issue, right? They said both were possibilities. So why did we choose this possibility instead? That is when it becomes difficult. Like there are times that, let's say we are building an expressway. So if we have to cut through a certain patch of forest, we have to. right? I mean, it makes sense. Yeah. But in this case, I was quite surprised that we took this option instead. Yeah.
I suppose, when what I'm hearing from you is that we need to have more conversations on what we prioritize, right? Because more often than not, we think we are very kiasu and it's growth at all costs, right? We want to as fast as possible, as great as possible, as big as possible, as many as possible, right? So we kind of are constantly aspiring for better, but better can look very different, if we also prioritize other things, right? Joseph, could I get your views on this as well? Yes.
The view on the cross island thing, or
Well, the other question,
forest?
yeah. What benefits a forest will have?
So yes, you mentioned mental health. I think having certain nature areas protected is also quite essential to our sense of identity. I think many Singaporeans feel because the environment is always changing and changing very quickly. Buildings are here 1 minute and then it's another building, and then the road changes. So I think if you keep some of your nature areas, well, at least there's a constant. So that sense of identity, with climate change, we need all the cooling, the natural cooling that we can get. So that's another kind of benefit. And I think most, well, equally, if not more importantly, is that the biodiversity, the value of wildlife is intrinsic. It is important not only because of what it can do for us. It is important because they are simply part of our community of life. So recognizing that nature, plants and animals also have that right to live, and not only because they are somehow useful to us.
I love this concept of nature having a right to live. And I wanted to go into what other jurisdictions are doing. And I think you've shared a little bit about what some jurisdictions do in a private conversation, of course, and I thought I'd bring it out here about recognizing legal personalities of animals, of even rivers. Could you share with us a little bit more about that and how we can draw upon that as inspiration for Singapore?
So the inspiration or the idea of giving legal rights or legal personality to non-humans is said to come from the idea of come from indigenous peoples, where they treat nature, whether it's individual species or entire mountain or river, as part of their community, as part of, they think of wildlife as their family, as their so and in some countries, say in South America, there's Ecuador, or in New Zealand, or in India, they have recognized rivers as legal persons. And in Ecuador, the right of nature is enshrined in the constitution. But it's not enough to just say that a river has rights, because then you have to implement this. And so typically what goes along with, whether it's through the legislature or through the courts, giving a river or nature a legal personality, is also to appoint guardians to speak on behalf of the river. So usually it would be indigenous people that lives very sort of closely with that river, to be the guardians of that river. And in India, it's the same. And then in Ecuador, they recognize groups of people with standing to challenge laws or decisions that violate the rights of nature. And so the courts can enforce that and cite the constitutional provision. These are very early kind of implementation of the idea of rights of nature. I think there's still a lot of questions to think through. How would this actually work in practice?
Ganesh?
I just add a bit to what Joseph shared. I'm a more sentimental person, so I talk a lot about non-technical stuff and what we have observed in the garden. And I think there was an excellent article that came out from North America this year about insects being sentient beings. Something that a lot of people have been denying them for a long time. And I think I can't remember the exact details of the article, but we could find that. And one example I want to give, because as you know, we have spoken about the common birdwing, right? So it's a butterfly that I've been observing very keenly for a long time. And that's one thing that I've been sharing with my visitors and even experts in the field, that, the birdwing butterflies, they come as a pair. We always think that the males go to any female, the female goes to any male, but they always come as a pair to the garden, and the male always waits for the female. It's amazing because we would never think that insects are capable of this kind of connection. Yeah, so I think that is important. And also, a few days ago, we had a walkabout with the Straits Times personnel, and they were there to ask me about butterfly gardens. And one thing I brought up that is often overlooked is people always look at food and shelter for the butterflies. But what we have noticed in the garden is they need a place to play, which we never think of actually. Yeah, as humans, all these animals are not any different from us. So we have to respect that we are all actually just animals at the end of the day, and we are all in the same group. Because every time butterflies chase each other, people think they're trying to mate.
Yes.
But I see that sometimes they are just playing around,
Yes.
Yeah, so it's just a personal observation that I wanted to share, a few observations. Yeah.
I think that's a great observation. As human beings, there's a kind of, I would say, human arrogance, because we think that we are the most evolved and we probably know more than, animals, for example, or insects even, because insects are, by sheer size in smaller, right? But I do feel that there's so much we have yet to find out. And we're only just starting to learn about these animals because of the development in technology as well. And I think, that the humility of recognizing that we don't know so much about these animals is so important as well. I want to go back to Joseph and to get your views as well. I wanted to know, how does Singapore's approach to biodiversity compare with other countries? We've talked a little bit about recognizing in term legal personality and recognizing their status as legal entities. But I thought it'd be good to see, where does Singapore stand, and are there any best practices we can adopt?
So I'll just need two. I think it's New Zealand. The law in New Zealand, if I am, I could be wrong, but I recall reading about this, that the law in New Zealand is such that all government agencies have a duty in the discharge of their functions to consider the impact of their decisions on the biodiversity. In Singapore, we don't have a law to that effect, although we do practice this whole of government approach. That says everything is connected. And so government agencies should also consider biodiversity, although that's not enshrined in the law. Now, the other thing that I think we are lacking in, which is actually widely practiced, is to have an EIA legislation. EIA stands for Environmental Impact Assessment. A 2019 study said that found that there were about 95% of the countries in the world have an EIA legislation. That is to say, the law makes an EIA mandatory whenever there are certain activities being proposed, or when certain activities are likely to have a significant impact on the environment. Now, in Singapore, I mentioned earlier that we have a policy, not a law, where the URA can require, as a condition for giving planning permission, that an EIA is carried out when a proposed development is near a nature area, nature reserve, the coast, or have transboundary effects. So this is a policy versus having a law. And I think it's important to have the law for a number of reasons. Firstly, the law formalizes the process. It entrenches it. It also means that governments cannot easily sort of change or bypass the process. And it's not just about this government, it is about future governments is the equivalent of having an elected presidency to safeguard our financial reserves. We always worry about a future rogue government that tries to be popular by depleting our reserves. It's the same thing. A future government can also try to be popular by taking all nature areas into shopping malls or something, more trains, more MRT tracks. So you have a safeguard in legislation. Having that having the EIA in legislation also ensures institutional continuity. It means that whoever is in government will have that process, knowing that this is how it's done. Otherwise, from government to government, the implementation of that policy may change. And lastly, having the EIA legislation ensures environmental rule of law. This means that the rights and the duties of the regulators, of the regulated, are clearly set out. It is not just, I decide you want to have a require an EIA, or I don't decide. It is, the law says in certain situations you must have the EIA, or it's not. Everybody's clear. There's certainty. What is the process? What kind of rights of participation do the public have? What is the duty of the regulator to consider the feedback, to give reasons? So all that is entrenched in the law. It promotes a kind of transparency and good governance.
We have a question actually quite related to this. Would real estate developed on recently deforested grounds involve rules for residents? Prerequisites like coexistence training and signing non-removal commitments to protect fauna beyond a radius of 50 meters? Very specific. I don't think there are any regulations, but that's a really good suggestion, actually. I would think to involve rules for residents, especially on areas which are recently deforested. I think that's an excellent suggestion, to train occupants such that we can coexist by having coexistence training and signing non-removal commitments, so you leave the flora and fauna there. That's an interesting comment as well, which is when I moved into my BTO, I documented 700 to 1,000 species of insects. You're very hardworking. I think we can do more with this, especially with citizen science. I think you will be talking a little bit more about citizen science, Ganesh. A lot of our insect species aren't described. Thank you for that comment. I think, very, very good comments coming in and questions as well. But I do think, are there any rules actually when, you've planted on recently deforested areas? Are there any rules governing how citizens ought to interact? I'm not aware of any. I don't think both of us, both
Not
of
that
you.
I'm aware of, so.
Yeah, that actually would be a good comment, good, suggestion that should be brought forth to the powers that be. Okay, let's move on to the next segment. And I think this was the most exciting one that both of you had very exciting comments on. What is the path forward? What do we want to see in Singapore in the coming years? And how do we envision the laws improving? And I asked you guys these questions when we were discussing, and I received the most exciting responses because I asked you, what's your wish list for Singapore moving forward? Okay, so maybe we can start with Ganesh. I see you have an entire list of things and you're ready to go. Can we start with you? What is your wish list for Singapore?
Okay, it's super extensive. I'll just mention 2 or 3 things. For me, first and foremost, I think it's related to what Joseph shared on EIAs. Yeah, so I also feel that EIAs should be compulsory in Singapore, and not only that, they should be publicly available at all times. Because there are certain, our EIAs are available for maybe sometimes a few months, but why can't we, just let the public be aware of these EIAs and how they are carried out and whatnot, right? And then one more thing is that I would like, in my personal opinion, is that I think we should co-conduct some EIAs with foreign independent companies. Yeah, this will remove bias and will show impartiality as well. And I think these are important, especially for big projects like now we're extending our airport, extending our causeway. These are extensive projects that need a lot of work for our EIA. So EIA aside, because EIA is generally in Singapore used for very destructive purposes. So they are carried out before that place is developed, right? So what our garden has started that we haven't really had the chance to share much yet, but what we are doing is something totally different from that. So what we are working on is coming out with a PCR. PCR is a preservation and conservation report that our garden is developing together with experts in the field. Yeah, and how important that is because it's more for as a constructive tool instead. Yeah. So how do you start an ecosystem, a whole habitat from scratch? Because we have so many grass patches in Singapore. And some of them actually have no plans. So even like if you see our SMRT depots, our army camps, we have so much of unused space that's just cut grass. Yeah. So why not we create these spaces for biodiversity? So it's a very pioneering thing that we are trying to do. And we hope that it can change this whole idea of the EIA being destructive. Yeah, so that's one thing we are trying to do. And another one is the iNaturalist program. So just like one of our viewers has mentioned, he himself as a single individual or as a family unit has identified almost 1,000 species. So imagine how much more we can do if 4 or 5 million of us are involved in this, right? Yeah. So
It's like playing Pokemon lah,
Correct,
identify the species as you travel Singapore.
yeah, or look out for like interesting stuff, right? That you're not used to. Yeah, so what we do is we have iNaturalist programs. We are trying to, we have run 3 so far. We'll even feature on the news for that. And next year onwards, we intend to have it every month. So we want to include citizens into our projects, especially with the PCR, to get them interested in nature and biodiversity. And at the same time, most importantly, give them ownership of looking after biodiversity in Singapore. Yeah, I think that is what is missing here. Like a lot of people will say, yeah, this so wasted this, so wasted that, right? But how can you be involved? Now you just need a handphone and you can come and help save biodiversity. So that's what we are trying to tell people. Yeah.
Joseph.
So as I said earlier, I think the EIA legislation is really lacking. We really should have that for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The other thing I wish to see, I hope to see, is a more active citizenry. A more active citizenry that will read carefully government development plans, go through EIA reports, ask questions, give feedback, whether it's to the regulator, the proposed developer, to your member of parliament, give feedback. What do you think? Should we have the next shopping mall or the next whatever development comes our way? And is there a way to have this on? Do we actually need this? Is there a way to do this with less impact? And then form groups to amplify your voices. And then separately, apart from being active citizens, thoughtful consumers. Because the thing about biodiversity and biodiversity law is it's not just the biodiversity laws that directly impact the biodiversity. It's also about the other laws and about other things we do. I mean, for example, if we consume more plastic and as a result there's more plastic pollution, that also affects biodiversity. If we choose to have more holidays and we fly more often and we accelerate climate change, that is also going to have impact on the biodiversity. So many of our actions may not necessarily seem like it initially. They actually have an indirect impact on our biodiversity. So when you're thinking about consuming, think about whether you need to consume, what is the impact of your consumption, how do you consume, can you give feedback to the people who make or import these products? Can you give feedback to the people who are producing these services that you're consuming on how they can do better, and so on?
I love that you've brought in this perspective that, protection of the environment and protection of biodiversity is not just for the woke people. Gardening is not just for the old people, right? The environment is for everyone, and we all have a voice. And you should use your voice. You should speak to, the especially if you have a view and you want to advocate for something, you have an ability to speak up. You are part of what we call active citizenry, right? You're part of a society. You're Singaporeans who have a voice, and you can give your feedback, and you should give your feedback. Maybe I can go back to Ganesh. I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, Sadhana, I just quickly add something. We're also in talks about doing networking sessions with community gardens, because I think a lot of people don't know what they don't know. Like, for example, if you see butterflies, you think caterpillars, they're going to eat my veggies, right? But caterpillars are very specific. Most of them will only go for their host plant. So once we teach them, and I think one thing that I'm happy in our garden, right, is that every community garden that visits us always approaches biodiversity differently. And they all start planting biodiversity plants as well. And I think the wrong idea that a lot of them have is this either or concept. They will either grow edibles or biodiversity. But we don't have to sacrifice one for the other. We can have both. There's a lot of unused space where your borders of the garden. And I always tell them, 2,000 community gardens, if each garden dedicates 1 meter square to biodiversity, that's 2,000 meters square,
Yes.
right? Yeah, it's a small number, but such a big impact.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that's a great point as well. And I thought we would go drill down into that to talk about what each of us can do to encourage biodiversity in our own capacity. But I just thought it would be good to highlight as well, just in case, it seems like we are fighting a losing battle in getting, protecting biodiversity. I think, Ganesh, you managed to very successfully work with NParks to set up your garden, and it was in collaboration with the government and also, NParks as well, to ensure that you have a thriving garden that is now a community space for all. I think that's a success story that we need to amplify, because it's not a case where it's impossible to convince anyone about it. Your voice mattered, and you approached it in a very collaborative manner with NParks, and you now have a beautiful garden, which I encourage all of you to visit as well. It was very eye-opening for me.
Yeah, many people think that gardens are only for gardeners. No, I think that's a wrong concept.
Yes. And also those retired, but I think gardens are actually meant for everybody. And I think even if you don't have a green thumb, there's always something to learn about a garden, even the flowers, the smells. There's this concept of what they call forest bathing, where you go into a forest and, it sort of washes away the negativity from the week, and then you end up emerging feeling really much more positive and much better. I think that concept as well is quite interesting. It's a Japanese concept, I believe. Am I on the mark here?
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you also shared that with me. Okay, let's talk about what individually we can do. Let's just say I'm not someone who wants to go and agitate for change. I'm very, introverted. I just want to know what I can do as a person to protect biodiversity and perhaps even encourage biodiversity. Maybe you can share with us first. Ganesh, I'll start with you and then I'll move on to Joseph. What do you think we can do to encourage biodiversity in the long run?
Okay, so I think the easiest, lowest commitment one is to join our iNaturalist program, because that is anytime and is on the way, by the way. And you just need your handphone. And it's good because why? Sometimes we need to know what species are found where. It's useful for the government as well. That is the easiest. And of course, for those who want to try out stuff, we are very happy to teach you how to plant plants. And we actually have a dedicated space at the front of the garden where whenever we do massive pruning and whatnot, we always leave our stuff there before NParks clears them. So they'll be there about 2 or 3 days and people can come and take whatever they want. So that we have legalized that part, Yeah. So what we want is we want to share with people. And I think more gardens should do that, and so we run our open house every 3 months, every quarterly. And during that time, we give out cuttings and seeds. I mean, we don't charge for anything. Yeah, we just want people to grow more wildflowers, more biodiversity plants. Yeah, so if you're interested to do that, or sometimes some people just like to grow stuff, but they don't want a garden, I've met quite a number of people like that. So for me, I just pass them some seeds. Once the seedlings grow, they pass them back to me to plant in the garden. or they come and plant with their family, which is so nice. Yeah. So that is two ways from my side on how we are doing things at our space.
How does this feature in an HDB context? Because Singapore is all about high-rise apartments. We don't have the ability to grow gardens in the ground. So how does what you're suggesting feature? Let's just say if we're staying in an HDB flat.
Okay, I think that is such a relevant question, right? One thing I would actually recommend is a lot of butterfly host plants don't need much light. So you can grow them. And I think what you mentioned very early in our session today was our focus is nature, not really ourselves. And I think we have to cross that mindset into that mindset, Yeah, so we need to grow what's useful for her. It's nice for us to sometimes have what we want, but like what you mentioned, a corridor is not always practical. Yeah, like some people want to grow fruit trees, right? You're never going to flower or fruit, right? Then you waste that space. Why not you grow stuff that is beneficial to nature, and you will learn to appreciate her more also. Yeah, so that's my advice. Come to gardens like ours, any community garden around you, go and ask them for advice. Like I say, books and the websites can only tell you so much, but talk to experienced people on what you can grow and how, and more important than that, how can you contribute? Yeah, I think that is important. Yeah.
Joseph?
Well, thanks for a very good and I think comprehensive answer. I don't really have anything more to add other than what I said earlier about citizenry, being active citizens and thoughtful consumers. I think we really need those to be the citizen and the consumer in both your roles. I mean, if you feel shy about speaking up, then at least it's not enough, but at least in your consumption patterns and habits, kind of spare a thought for the impacts of your consumption on what it means for biodiversity, not just here, but also biodiversity in other parts of the world where your product is made or mined or sourced.
I really like that you're drawing attention to things that we can stop doing, because there are things that we can actively do to encourage or promote protection of biodiversity, but there are also things that we can stop doing. And I always think it's probably easier to cut back on something than to actively go out to do something. So the idea of being more mindful, more demure about our consumption patterns as well. And I think,
sorry, can I
yes.
just add on to
Sure.
this? So I think what you said is true, what should we not do as well?
Yes.
Right. I think one problem we are facing, if you see the last few months, is the increase in the crow population, right? So a lot of these urban birds are growing in populations and they're not very healthy for us in terms of disease and whatnot, right? And they actually attack our own native species. You remember when we were much younger, there were so many sparrows around, right? You rarely see them these days, right? Which is a very big concern for us. Yeah, so stop littering, very basic thing, and also stop feeding the birds, Yeah, they will find their way. Yeah, nature always has her way. Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective, because there's a philosophy that if you feed animals or if you feed birds, it gives you good karma, right? And I think what you're sharing with me actually shows it's the reverse. I'm actually potentially killing some sparrows.
And it's illegal to feed wild animals without permission.
I have never fed birds in my life, and I shall endeavor not to do so because it is illegal and it results in the murder of sparrows as well. I thought it'd be good to round up by talking about misconceptions about the environment. I think we've gone into quite a fair few of those. For example, do not feed the pigeons, because apart from the fact that they cause issues, they are also affecting the natural balance of the environment. Maybe we can start with Joseph. What are some of the common misconceptions about biodiversity that you would like to clarify for the audience today?
Okay, so I will speak about the misconceptions of biodiversity laws. And the first one is associating the quality of our laws with the quality of the environment, or quality of biodiversity laws with the quality of the biodiversity. Whether a law is good enough or not doesn't only depend on whether the environment or the biodiversity is of whether we have enough biodiversity. Because apart from making sure that we have a good environment, making sure that we have a rich biodiversity, there also is another function, and that is to promote or enhance governance, good governance, as well as fair procedures and fair processes. So, respect to biodiversity law, one of the functions or important functions of biodiversity law is actually to make sure that it entrenches good governance and good processes. By good governance, I mean things like having transparency, access to information, and then also rights of participation from the public, and then also the duty to consider the public feedback. And all these actually can be part of an EIA legislation. So just because you have maybe a clean and green environment doesn't automatically mean you have good environmental law, because the law is more than just the outcome. Number two misconception, I alluded to this earlier, and that is that having good biodiversity law isn't enough. The misconception that all you need is good biodiversity laws, and I'm suggesting here that the other areas of law also play a part in ensuring that we have good biodiversity. For example, our pollution control laws. They may help to reduce pollution, but then that has an impact on biodiversity. Road traffic laws, what kind of vehicles you can put on the road, are they pollutive? These kind of things also have an impact on the environment. Laws on waste management, they also have an impact on biodiversity. So it's not just looking at the biodiversity law alone, it is also looking at all the other laws we have that may have a direct or indirect impact on the biodiversity.
I wanted to go quickly to the questions before we ask both of you for a key takeaway. One of the questions is, what is defined as wildlife which are protected by law? What if they could be pests like hornets or cockroaches?
So the wildlife is defined as, okay, I don't know the exact wording, but it is basically animals of a species that is of a wild nature. Under the Wildlife Act, there are all these are hornets and pests. They are also wildlife. However, the act itself creates exemptions. So, for example, certain pest species of birds, for example, or certain insects are actually exempted from the protection under the Wildlife Act. Okay. Hornets actually like these, they are wildlife, but unfortunately they don't get protection under the Wildlife Act. Neither do most invertebrates, for that matter, except for the few butterflies. One would be the common birdwing.
The next question, am I able to stop fogging or limit it given its extremely limited use and ineffectiveness in vector control in an area where there is good biodiversity or protected species? Ganesh, do you have any
answer to this?
Yes.
Okay, so for our area, it is right next to the playground. So there used to be very constant fogging. But once our garden started, we don't have mosquito problems anymore. Yeah, so one issue we had when I first started removing the lalang, right? There was so much of trash in the grass. And also once that was removed, we didn't have the issue. And once our biodiversity came, we actually requested NParks and Town Council to stop the fogging in our immediate vicinity. And actually they have, at least from what I've seen, they followed lah. Yeah. So do write to them, but make sure that the place is clean first, Yeah. Don't give them the chance to need fog. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of education as well, because for our garden, like I say, we are backed by a forest. So we have forest mosquitoes that come there. These are not the human disease carrying mosquitoes. And that's what we teach our people. So one thing you realize is that when they bite you and you come out, by the time you come out of the garden, right, the bum has gone down.
Mm.
Yeah, so don't assume every mosquito is an Aedes mosquito. Yeah, respect that mosquitoes are part of the ecosystem,
Mm.
and so know your area. So don't create their breeding grounds. Once again, like what I said just now, don't give them opportunity to grow. Yeah.
I think education is so important in this entire process, understanding and I think education on animals is one thing, education on insects and plants. That's something that I remember when I was in primary school, we had maybe a little bit of information on that at the science center. And then as we went on, we kind of lost touch with that aspect of our education. I think it ought to make a comeback. Okay. There is one last question before we go or rather two questions. One just came in. It seems like we have very good laws. In the panelists' opinion, do you think deterrence is adequate towards offenders when it comes to biodiversity protection? Joseph?
The laws actually provide for quite significant maximum punishments. I think sometimes the offenders are not always kind of not given sufficiently heavy punishments. Of course, you have to balance that with other factors because in the case of the pangolin that you mentioned, I think there were other considerations like this person didn't know, or he claimed he didn't know, and so you want to punish, but you also have to not overly sort of punish offenders. Where is that balance? Well, personally, I think sometimes I think the some of the punishments are a bit too lenient. Okay, so that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, agreed.
You feel that
Yeah.
the punishments that are imposed appear to be
sometimes.
lenient.
Yeah,
right?
because I just share our own example. We used to have a theft occurring almost every week at some point in the garden, but once I asked the police for permission to put up my police report, like serial numbers and all, so the police logo was there, right? You'll be amazed at how the theft just dropped. So that's how powerful the deterrence is.
I think in recent times as well, in a statement, I think on 29th of August, which I was referring to at the start of the webinar, wildlife trading and keeping of scheduled species like flying foxes will be considered serious offences under the Organised Crime Act from 30th of August. So I think Singapore is taking steps to recognise or enhance penalties, because I think now the penalties have been enhanced, given that it may be serious offences, to up to 20 years in prison. And I think that's a fairly serious step for Singapore. I would say it's a big accomplishment. Could we do more? The answer always is yes, I suppose. And the last question, perhaps, Ganesh, is how long did it take for WBG to get to where it is today?
We just turned 4 in July. But I would say after the test, they tested me. The preview was on the spot, and it was about half an hour, and they accepted my answers. So we got it officially approved on the day itself. So I think sometimes it's really about where your heart lies. Yeah, and when you talk about biodiversity, I think NParks is quite supportive, lah. Yeah, if you want to, like I said, who are you growing for? Yeah. So do try to go along those lines. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. Very quickly, in one line, perhaps with Oxford Commerce, I suppose, what is the one key takeaway that you want the audience members to bring with them when their webinar ends? Joseph.
So, one sentence, did you say?
If possible.
So, my one takeaway is everyone has a duty and a right to take care of our biodiversity, and they can exercise this right by being vigilant about others who are not doing their duty to protect the environment, whether it is through not doing the environment, not taking care of the environment by complying with laws or by enforcing the laws which are already there. Of course, they have a duty to also comply with the laws that protect the biodiversity.
Thank you. Ganesh?
Okay, so for me, it's just about never stop fighting for what you think is worth fighting for. And Mother Nature, Mother Earth are always worth fighting for. And just as importantly, never undermine the power you have as an individual to effect change. Yeah, I think these are the two giveaways I have for our takeaways. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My key takeaway from the both of you is really to educate myself. I think we need to acknowledge that we don't know everything, and it's always good to continue to learn about the environment and its role in our lives and how we fit in the environment as well. Okay, we have to bring the session to a close. Today, we discussed about how we can protect our own backyard by looking at the legal protection for Singapore's biodiversity. You also learned that you can and are able to grow plants. Please get in touch with Ganesh if you want to find out more and visit the Woodlands Botanical Garden. If you are a furry and feathery pet lover like I am, please join us on Wednesday, 18 September 2024 at the same time, 7:30 p.m. I will be on the panel this time on the receiving end of difficult questions, focusing on legal protections against animal cruelty and neglect. The discussion will delve into scenarios like pet abandonment, inadequate care, and recognizing signs of animal cruelty and what you can do about it. This and many more webinars are part of Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2024. You can scan the QR code or visit the website go.gov.sg/law-cdc to register for this webinar and many more webinars that are available over the course of the next few weeks. At the end of this webinar, a survey form will pop up on your screen for your completion. We appreciate your comments as it will be used to improve future webinars that will be curated for you. Lastly, after today's fantastic sharing from our panelists, if you find that you require legal guidance on our issues, on your legal issues, my apologies, do write to help@probono.sg. We'd like to express our gratitude to Joseph and Ganesh for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Thank you very much for your time. With that, and on behalf of Pro Bono SG, thank you all for joining us today, this evening, and have a good rest of the week ahead. Bye-bye.
Bye.